February 19th, 1944. Lake Tinchø, Telemark, Norway. The wind howled down from the Hardangervidda Plateau, scattering snow across the icy surface like ash. The lake was black beneath the night sky, a frozen mirror framed by mountains. Along the narrow road that hugged its edge, two men moved through the darkness, carrying a wooden crate that looked far too heavy for its size. Knut Haukelid adjusted his grip and glanced toward the faint lights of the dock below. "If this goes wrong," he whispered, "they'll find what's left of us before they find the bomb." His partner, Rolf Sorley, gave a grim nod. The crate contained a single charge, a carefully built explosive with a time fuse wrapped in canvas and rubber to survive the cold water. Inside the ferry SF Hydro, sitting at the dock below, were 40 barrels of deuterium oxide, heavy water, the last remnants of Nazi Germany's nuclear program. The men could see their breath hanging in the air as they crouched behind a snowbank. Down below, the ferry's crew moved under lantern light, their boots crunching on the frozen boards. The Hydro was set to depart at dawn, carrying German guards, civilians, and a cargo the Reich considered priceless. To the Germans, Norway's hydroelectric plants were just another occupied asset. But to the Allies, the facility at Vemork and the precious heavy water it produced was the key to one of the most secret races of the war, the race to build the atomic bomb. The earlier sabotage in 1943 had crippled production, but not destroyed it. The Germans, desperate to move what was left, ordered the remaining barrels shipped east, and now they were loaded on this ferry. The resistance had learned of it through whispers passed in farmhouses and coded radio bursts to London. And now it fell to Haukelid's team, members of the Norwegian resistance and veterans of Operation Gunnerside, to finish what they had started. Haukelid checked his watch. 2:15 a.m. They had to move fast. He and Sorley crept down the slope, staying low against the wind, until the hull of the Hydro loomed before them, dark and immense against the ice-flecked water. They climbed aboard silently, the deck slick beneath their boots. Below, the cargo hold smelled of oil and cold metal. Flashlights flickered briefly, revealing rows of barrels marked Norsk Hydro. The men worked by touch, crouching in the dim light. Sorley opened the crate, exposing the detonator assembly, a British-made time fuse and primer attached to a small charge of plastic explosive. "Where?" Sorley asked quietly. "Starboard keel beam," Haukelid replied. "Low enough that the blast will flood her, not blow her apart." They weren't here to make a spectacle. The plan was simple: sink the ferry in the lake's deepest section, where recovery would be impossible. The silence inside the hold was broken only by the groan of the ship's timbers and the sound of distant wind. Every movement felt amplified, every clink of metal like thunder. Haukelid knelt, setting the timer to detonate several hours after departure, ensuring the explosion would occur far from shore. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the bitter cold seeping through his gloves. He tightened the last bolt and whispered a quick prayer. "For Norway," Sorley murmured beside him. They retraced their steps carefully, leaving no trace. On deck, the first faint gray of dawn glimmered across the mountains. The men disappeared into the forest, their tracks already vanishing under fresh snow. By morning, the SF Hydro steamed into the center of Lake Tineo. Passengers huddled inside for warmth, German soldiers, Norwegian civilians, even women and children heading east. No one aboard had any idea that a silent clock was ticking below their feet. The ferry's captain joked with his crew as they broke through the ice at the lake's edge. The air was sharp, the sunlight weak, reflecting off the water like shards of glass. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, metal ticked softly, once every second. 7 hours later, at 10:45 a.m., the Hydro reached the deepest part of the lake. A muffled crack echoed through the hull. The ship lurched violently to starboard, Crates and barrels rolled across the deck as passengers screamed. Water rushed in, cold and black, flooding through the ruptured hull. Within seconds, the engines died. The captain shouted orders, but it was too late. The SF Hydro began to list sharply. Some jumped into the freezing water. Others clung to debris as the ferry groaned and slipped beneath the surface. On shore, farmers saw the column of smoke rise from the middle of the lake. They didn't know it yet, but at that moment, as 40 barrels of heavy water sank into the abyss, the German atomic program went with them. And in a cabin overlooking the valley, Knut Haukelid listened to distant reports over his radio. When he heard the words "ferry lost, unknown explosion," he closed his eyes, exhaled, and whispered, "It's done." 6 months earlier, the winter wind screamed through the gorges above Rjukan, the same valley where it all began. The Vamork plant, perched on a narrow ledge above the Mona River, looked more like a fortress than a factory. Its concrete walls were coated with ice. Its chimneys exhaled plumes of steam into the frozen air. Inside, German guards patrolled catwalks between humming turbines and massive electrolytic cells producing one of the rarest substances on Earth, deuterium oxide, heavy water. The Allies didn't fully understand the Nazis' nuclear research, but British intelligence was sure of one thing: Germany was trying to build an atomic bomb. Their scientists, led by Werner Heisenberg, believed that heavy water could moderate the reactions needed to sustain a nuclear chain. And in all of occupied Europe, only one place produced it in quantity: Vemork. Early attempts to stop production had failed. In 1942, a daring British glider assault, Operation Freshman, ended in disaster when both aircraft crashed in the mountains. Survivors were captured and executed under Hitler's infamous commando order. But the Norwegians didn't give up. By early 1943, a new team, Norwegian commandos trained in Britain, parachuted onto the Hardangervidda Plateau. Their mission: infiltrate Vamork and destroy the electrolysis cells. Among them was Knut Haukelid, the same man who would one day plant the bomb aboard the SF Hydro. The team lived like ghosts in the mountains, skiing through snowstorms, sleeping in stone huts, and subsisting on reindeer meat and powdered soup. Their code name was Gunnerside. They carried British-made Sten guns, compasses, and small charges of plastic explosive, each man knowing the penalty for capture was death. On the night of February 27, 1943, they made their move. Under a moonless sky, the saboteurs crept down a ravine beneath the power station, crossing an icy river by crawling along a pipe suspended high above the torrent. Below them, the water roared. One slip, and they'd vanish into the darkness. Inside the plant, the Norwegian night watchmen, secretly sympathetic to the resistance, looked the other way as they cut through the perimeter fence. The saboteurs moved swiftly through the basement, placing time charges on the high-pressure vessels that held the heavy water. At 1:30 a.m., a dull explosion shook the mountain. The commandos vanished back into the wilderness before the Germans realized what had happened. By sunrise, the Vemork facility was crippled. In London, the news electrified Allied command. Churchill called it one of the most remarkable acts of sabotage in the war. But the Germans repaired the damage faster than expected, and production, though diminished, resumed. By late 1943, intelligence reports indicated that the remaining stock of heavy water was being prepared for transport to Germany. The Allies debated air raids or commando strikes, but both carried enormous risks for civilian lives in the steep populated valleys below. It was Haukelid who proposed the simplest and most dangerous solution: sabotage the transport itself. He knew the routes by heart: narrow roads carved into mountainsides, ferry crossings over deep glacial lakes. One such ferry, the SF Hydro, ran daily across Lake Tinchjo. It was the only link between the Vemork Valley and the railway to Oslo. If the heavy water were shipped east, Germany's atomic program might yet recover. If it sank, the war's most secret weapon would be lost forever. The decision tore at Haukelid. The ferry carried not just German soldiers, but civilians, including women and children. His orders were clear: stop the shipment, no matter what. But as a man who had fought to protect his homeland, the thought of innocent Norwegians dying in the blast haunted him. For weeks, he and his resistance network tracked the barrel's movement. On February 18, 1944, the shipment was confirmed. The heavy water would board the hydro the next morning. How Khalid wired London. Final transport arranged. Will act tonight. He spent the last hours before the mission in silence, scribbling a note in his small field diary. This may be my last night alive. If it succeeds, the world may never know what was stopped here. The world wouldn't, not for decades. When the SF Hydro disappeared beneath the frozen waters of Lake Tinchia the next morning, it was written off as a tragic accident. The Germans launched an investigation, but found no trace of the cargo. The barrels of heavy water settled nearly 1,400 feet below the surface, beyond the reach of any diver or machine, and with them sank Germany's last hope of catching up to the Allied atomic program. In secret, the OSS and British intelligence sent coded messages of congratulations to the Norwegian resistance. The Allies had won one of the most critical invisible battles of the war, and almost no one knew it. Yet for Haukelid, victory came with silence. In later years, when asked about that night, he simply said, "We did what had to be done, but I still think about those who didn't come home from the lake." The morning after the explosion, Lake Tinchia was eerily still. The wind had died, the sky hung gray and heavy, and smoke from the sinking had already dispersed into the mountain air. Only a few wooden planks and pieces of cargo bobbed in the freezing water, reminders of what had vanished beneath. In Rjukan, word spread quickly. The SF Hydro was gone. The local telegraph office buzzed with messages to Oslo, to Berlin, to the German occupation authorities. Survivors were being pulled from the lake's edge, frostbitten, shivering, barely conscious. Some had clung to the wreckage for hours before rescue boats found them. Others were lost to the depths, sealed forever in the cold black water. The Germans immediately suspected sabotage. They dispatched divers and engineers to the site, but the lake was too deep, over 400 meters at its center. No diver in 1944 could reach such depths. German officers interrogated local workers, searched homes, and detained anyone with known resistance ties, but no trace of the explosives was ever found. Knut Haukelid, hidden in a safe house high in the mountains, listened in silence to radio broadcasts reporting an unfortunate mechanical failure. He knew better, and so did the British in London. His coded transmission, "Cargo lost, lake secure," reached Allied headquarters days later. It was the last chapter in a mission that had begun years earlier, with a handful of men parachuting into the Arctic night. Still, the cost weighed on him. 18 people had died, including civilians. When the news reached the Norwegian government in exile in London, there was celebration tempered by sorrow. The operation had succeeded beyond measure, but in war, even victory carried ghosts. Over the following months, the German nuclear program faltered. With no heavy water supply, their experiments at Leipzig and Berlin stalled. Heisenberg's team resorted to crude substitutes, never achieving a controlled chain reaction. The Allies, meanwhile, surged ahead with the Manhattan Project, an effort so vast and secret that even many of its scientists didn't know its true purpose. In a way, the quiet act of sabotage on that frozen lake helped decide which side of history would hold the atom's power first. Years passed, the war ended, Norway was liberated in May 1945, and Haukelid returned home as both hero and ghost, celebrated for his bravery, haunted by his memories. The heavy water raids were declassified slowly, their details trickling into public awareness in the 1950s. The story of the SF Hydro became legend, whispered in classrooms, written into books, immortalized on film. But beneath Lake Tinchya, the wreck still slept. For decades, it remained untouched, a tomb preserved by cold and pressure. Fishermen avoided the site, saying the lake didn't like to be disturbed. Locals claimed that on still nights, when the wind stopped and the water lay flat as glass, you could see faint shapes under the surface, outlines of barrels or the ghostly hull of a ferry frozen in time. Then, in 1993, nearly 50 years after the sinking, a Norwegian research team decided to find the truth. Using sonar and remote-operated submersibles, they mapped the bottom of the lake. What they found was astonishing. The SF Hydro still stood upright, its decks intact, cabins preserved, windows unbroken. Inside the cargo hold, the cameras revealed rows of rusted metal drums, the barrels of heavy water, untouched since 1944. The saboteurs' mission, it turned out, had been even more precise than anyone imagined. The explosion had breached the keel without scattering the cargo. The ferry had gone down cleanly, its deadly secret locked away for half a century. Scientists examined the barrels carefully. The deuterium oxide inside, now inert, still carried faint radiation signatures, evidence of the German nuclear effort that once threatened to change the course of the war. Norwegian officials decided to leave most of the wreck undisturbed, designating it a war grave. When journalists asked Haukelid, by then an old man, what he thought of the discovery, he smiled faintly. "Let it sleep," he said. "It's done its duty. That lake has carried our secret long enough." He died in 1994, 50 years after the mission that defined him. His resting place overlooks the same mountains where the resistance once skied through blizzards and darkness, guided only by courage and conviction. Even today, the waters of Lake Tinchya remain deep and still, a mirror over one of the most consequential acts of sabotage in human history. Beneath it lie the remains of a ferry, 40 barrels of heavy water, and the moment the Nazi atomic dream sank forever, and somewhere in the silence of that depth, the echoes of Haukelid's whispered words still seem to linger, for Norway and for the world.